Are we ready? I'm getting the... So we are, welcome, hello. This is the grand opening of our newest temporary exhibit. As many of you know, there's a history of horror, really, about a local factory that caused the death and illness of many of our community, a deadly deception, the Asbestos Tragedy in McLean County. We are also live streaming this event, and I want to thank our live stream sponsor, presented by WGLT. So we're very fortunate that they're making this available to anyone. We have a McHistory, MC History YouTube channel. You can find all of our live stream programs for free online. You just have to go look for it. So that's good to know. My name is Julie Emig. I'm the executive director here at the McLean County Museum of History. And if for some reason in the next 30, 40 minutes, if you need to use the facilities, I always like to remind people that they are on the ground floor and there is a working elevator, thanks to the County of McLean. I want to acknowledge some of our guests today, and I see I have some museum staff members out there. I've got Michaela Harris, who's Director of Communications. She's running the live stream. Jeff Woodard just snuck in. He's in the back. Hello. And Eric Hansen is our Director of Volunteers. It's good to see you. And Jeff is Director of Marketing and Community Outreach. And Hannah Johnson, welcome back. It's good to have you here. Many of you know Hannah. She was an educator at the museum for many years and is now running the Illinois Art Station, but it's great to see you. I also want to acknowledge all of the people in the audience who are members of unions. Who's a member of a union? Excellent. Oh, I love it. That's a wonderful thing. So much of what is possible for our working population, the rights that are so important to acknowledge, and just the protections that are deserved. We really need to have a strong labor community. And LiUNA in particular is the presenting sponsor of this asbestos exhibit. I don't think we could have done it without their support, so I wanted to acknowledge that they helped us with that. How many of you in the audience are connected to someone who worked at the plant, who got sick, who died? Many of you have shared your stories with us. We couldn't do this mostly without your willingness to be vulnerable and open up and let us know what happened. And as many of you know, our mission here at the museum is to preserve, educate, and collaborate in sharing the diverse stories of our community. And we are completely committed to telling the whole story, sharing the whole of history. We are committed to being bold, even if sometimes what we learn isn't good. Robert Penn Warren, who's one of my favorite authors, published a book of meditations related to the Civil War, and he said that history cannot give us a program for the future, but it can give us a fuller understanding of ourselves and of our common humanity so that we can better face the future. Or perhaps more to the point, philosopher George Santayana said, "A country without a memory is a country of madmen." We need to know what happened. And I have another very important staff member to introduce as well. I saved her for last. Director of Exhibits, Susan Hartsold, who is, oh my gosh, she's right over here. This is the mastermind behind that exhibit on the third floor. And she has been working her tail off getting this together, and it is phenomenal. She co-curated it with my friend, labor activist, historian, writer, and just all-around good guy, Mike Matika. Mike is gonna share a lot more information about the exhibit, and he will take questions too after he's given you his, well, his story.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. I got the...
Oh, right, you're all mic'd up.
Okay, thanks, Julie. And again, thank all of you for coming out. This is I made this remark last weekend. Sometimes this isn't always just sunshine city, you know, all the wonderful things that happen in our community. But I think it's very important that we have an institution like this museum that's willing to tackle hard questions about our community and really think about who we are and what's gone on and what's impacted people in our community. And Susan and I have worked together on, I think she reminded me the other day, 7 exhibits at this museum. So, and it's always a pleasure, and she does an incredible job if you've been upstairs to see this, because this is not an exhibit where we can show you artifact. You know, we don't have asbestos in the room. So it had to be done in a visual way, and she did a really wonderful way of pulling that together where you get the story both from the local and the national perspective with that. And this exhibit actually started as a thought 10 years ago. Mark Dunn was an attorney in Bloomington, lives in Chicago now, and Mark was a board member and said, we ought to do an exhibit about UNARCO. And most folks were like, is this something we want to tackle? And we did. And a big thank you to Jim Walker. Jim's here with us. Jim. Jim was the attorney on many of the cases, and Jim gave us 5 banker boxes of files. And by going through those, and with the help of student interns, we were able then to construct the story. And what was so powerful, and what you'll see upstairs, is the direct quotes from people who worked there, who suffered through the experience, and what it was like to be there, plus the corporate people who under oath did not lie. And that was very striking because the people from the corporations basically admitted, yes, we knew what we were doing. We were poisoning people, we were killing people. But under oath, they admitted that, yes, they had knowledge of the dangers of what they were working with. So having those depositions was just very incredible to have. And just good friends here, the Tipswords, the Maus, the Redmonds, who have suffered through what that plant did, and I'm sure there's others here too. My friend, fellow laborer Larry Mertes, who worked at the plant, and Diane Shield here, because it wasn't just UNARCO. Diane Shields was the health and safety eyes and ears at the workforce at Eureka Company, and there was asbestos there too. So as any workplace, it probably was being used at some point, and I think that's something we'll come back to maybe think about later too. As I consider this, rather than trying to tell the story of what went on, just think about a working person, maybe finishing high school. I need a job. You know, I want to have a relationship, I want to get married, I want to raise a family, I want to have a roof over my head, I want to eat. Where do I get a job? And so people looking for a place to go to find a job aren't always like, oh, here's my career path I'm planning out. I need some money, you know, I got to make a living. And so if there's a factory in town, a workplace, a construction site that's accessible to people, that's hiring folks go and get a job. And when they're doing that, there's a certain level of trust that the employer is going to pay them decently, going to treat them decently, and somehow protect them at that work site. And as we find in this story of United Asbestos and Rubber Company, yeah, people got paid. It wasn't one of the best paying jobs in town, but they were knowingly exposed to a carcinogenic hazardous substance. And again, looking through the materials that Jim has in the depositions, the company has legal records they were keeping. They were keeping track of what they were doing. They were watching over people's health and seeing, basically charting the workforce, knowing what was happening to them. And before UNARCO came to Bloomington, they had operated in Cicero, Illinois. And after 20 plus years in Cicero, what was happening? They were getting sued, the death toll was mounting. So what do? We shut the door and we go to a new location. And they come to Bloomington. And just to maybe think about that time period, the largest employer before State Farm in Bloomington was the Chicago and Alton Railroad on the west side of Bloomington. Through World War II, there were 1,400 people, machinists, boilermakers, who worked in that plant on a regular basis. And particularly the steam locomotive, which ran the trains, took a lot of hand labor on a daily basis. Right after World War II, they brought in the diesel electric locomotive, and from 1,400 people, they went to less than 500 people. 1,000 people were out of a job. And this huge building on the west side, which was built in 1914 as a locomotive back shop, where they did the locomotive repairs, was suddenly not needed as much anymore. So here comes this company, oh, we're gonna move in here, we're gonna create 200 to 300 new jobs in town. Everybody's like, isn't this wonderful? We've got a new employer in town. We've got new opportunity here. So UNARCO moves into the locomotive back shop there on the west side. And it's, again, that pattern of closing in one place, opening in another place, probably knowing in 20 or 25 years they're gonna desert Bloomington. And Terry can share that his dad was told at one point, well, we're thinking of moving to Paris, Illinois, after they've been here for 20 years. We're gonna find another green place to start the cycle over again. And by that time, the knowledge of what this substance did had started to catch up with them, and that move never happened. But I just think of folks who are looking for a job, looking to raise a family, and trying to find a way to live and survive, and walk into a workplace presuming, they can make a decent living here. It's a unionized workplace. They have a union there. They can have some negotiation over their wages, but the company basically ignores them when they try to negotiate about health conditions and safety conditions within the workplace. And these are all hardworking people. They got great work ethic. They're out to take care of their family. And the kind of, I don't know what the right word would be, but to think with asbestos-related diseases, it's not immediately obvious. It's something that catches up with you 20, 25 years later. And so folks are hardy, they're physically fit, they're working, and suddenly things start happening to their health. They're having problems breathing. They're having problems with other organs in their body. And asbestos, to remember, even though it looks like fiber, is a mineral. And asbestos breathed in lodges in the lungs. And eventually the lung tissue, to protect itself, surrounds and basically puts a barrier around that asbestos fragment in the lung. And what it basically does is eventually put the person in a situation where they can barely breathe. It's almost death by suffocation at that point. Or the asbestos fibers lead to cancer because it's a foreign substance in the body. And so here are folks who are healthy, and suddenly over a 2, 3, or 4-year period, their health decreases dramatically. And suddenly people who were earning the livelihood for their family are denied the power to do that. And again, what does that do to the children who are here today? What does that do to the family? What does that do to their survival? And as you look around upstairs and look at the photographs, just so telling when you read the testimony that Jim got from some of the workers. almost like being in a snowstorm. So imagine 4 tons of asbestos being brought in by rail car every day, burlap bags, so it's not well sealed, and then being brought into this workplace, cut open with a knife and put into the machines to weave it into cloth. Creates a lot of airborne fragments and dust. So, and that plant had a big set of skylights across the top of it for ventilation and for light. So people describe looking up as the afternoon sun's coming in and just seeing, again, like snow. All these fibers floating in the air. And that means fibers that people are taking into their body. We just went through COVID, and we all learned to wear a little mask, okay? If you're dealing with asbestos, you probably should have a respirator. But what were workers given when they were available was a little foam mask, which quickly clogged up with the material, clogged up with the asbestos, and that's if the mask was even available. And Cheryl shared the story of her dad who took a bandana handkerchief and tied it around their neck to try to even have some protection when the masks were not available, and management coming out and saying, take that off. Because this maybe creates an illusion that there's something here that's dangerous. Another one of the stories that comes out of the depositions is people asking questions, is this stuff safe? And a manager scooping some asbestos off the floor and eating it and saying, oh, this stuff is fine, it won't hurt you. So the company actually actively creating that environment and reassuring people that they're in a safe environment in that situation. And again, when we get the depositions that Jim collected, and the company is taking workers in on an annual basis to get an x-ray. Why do they want an x-ray every year from every employee? Because they know what's going on. And they're going to monitor those x-rays over years, and if they see the disease developing, that becomes what they called easing out time, where they would go to the worker and say, we think you may have come down with the disease, you're going to get laid off. How about we offer you a little settlement here and just sign away that you've been taken care of, sign away your rights in that situation. So in other words, if somebody was getting sick, let's get that person out of circulation from within the workplace and basically leave them and their family to fend for themselves. And one of the other things that shows up in those depositions is just the idea that the company was self-insured, that instead of having an insurance company who would cover them, they created a false front paper company so that if they did have to pay a settlement, they would pay it out of company proceeds and would not have to bear the cost of actually doing insurance for people and having a legitimate insurance carrier to take care of folks in those situations. So you think about all those duplicitous situations that people are exposed to, and eventually mounting up where you have families where the breadwinner of the family, maybe at age 45, 43, 50, suddenly is not able to earn an income anymore, is succumbing to a disease that's going to be a death sentence for that person. And what happens to that family? How do they support themselves? Who's going to take care of the kids? If the mother had been home taking care of the family, she may not have been out in the workforce. Where's the income going to come from? And something that Terry shared, I think, was a good reflection that as we work, we accumulate our own capital that we pass on to our next generation. If you've been denied 10 to 15 to 20 years of your working life, what do you have left to pass on to the next generation? So in other words, this is something that impacts not just those that are immediate, but is going to impact the children and the grandchildren in that situation too. So it's just so tragic, but at the same time, UNARCO in Bloomington is not unique. This is an industry, and I think Susan very effectively did this. When you walk into that exhibit, you see that row of products. You know, and if we went around the room here, when did you touch asbestos in your life? I grew up in a house with asbestos shingles. My wife's dad was an auto mechanic who put asbestos brakes on cars. What's the insulation that was wrapped around the pipe, whether in a workplace or in your home? Even your ironing board cover may have had asbestos on it. So all those everyday products were potentially an opportunity for exposure, not just to the worker, but to family and to folks like that also. And then again, somebody who works there carrying asbestos home with them. Who does the laundry? Who cleans up? How much asbestos is being brought into the household? And I keep picking on Terry because I think it's particularly powerful. Talks about running up to his dad's trouser legs when he comes home from work and clapping them just to see dust fly. It's asbestos right there in the family household. So that means that not only is the worker exposed, but the family's exposed. And there are a number of cases which we're documented and continuing to document of not just the worker getting exposed, but the spouse, the children, other people in the family getting exposed because of the fibers that are being brought into the household in that situation. As I think about working people are often the guinea pigs. You know, as an industry develops a product and thinks, boy, this is something we can make money on, how much time is given to think about, is this product safe? What are the long-term implications of this? Is this something that people are going to be able to use, or is it eventually something that's going to have a long-term impact on people? So what happens with asbestos in our economic system is not necessarily one of those things that is just, oh, that's just one instance. I think about the tobacco industry. You know, in the tobacco industry, that how many folks have been poisoned in the name of profit? How many families have suffered disease, particularly when you were smoking a cigarette that had an asbestos filter on it, which was once one of the, again, miracle products of the 60s. In Ottawa, Illinois, you can visit the site of the Radium Dial Company, where young women were painting clock faces with a uranium mixture. And when I look at the stories that came out of that workplace, those women were told, dip, lick, paint. In other words, put your paintbrush in the radium mix, put it in your mouth and twirl the paintbrush around to get a fine point, and then paint the numbers on the clock or paint the dials. And they were also told, you know, radium is wonderful for your complexion. So yeah, you're not going to be harmed by working with this. By the time they're 32, 33 years old, these women actually have pieces of their jaw falling out because of the exposure to the radium, and many of them are dying of cancer in those situations. Something that's kind of coming into our knowledge now is what's called forever chemicals. Think of Teflon frying pans. Think of Gore-Tex clothes. Those are made with, and don't ask me chemically to explain it, but now they're called forever chemicals that never break down in the environment. They're becoming part of our bodies, and particularly those that work with those are, again, the first ones exposed. Are we in the next 5-10 years going to suddenly have a whole nother flurry of lawsuits like we had with asbestos for workers that worked with those substances? And we're going to be showing later film from West Virginia about some of the factories where those chemicals are made and the situations that those folks have now lived with and are enduring. Microplastics. Plastic consumption and production continues to mount, but it is everywhere now in our environment. What's the long-term implication? And the people that are working with it are, again, often the first folks that are exposed to those situations. So as we look at this asbestos story, I think it's important to think of a couple things. Number one, corporate greed. Somebody's making money and doesn't really care what happens to people in the process of doing that. And then number two, how do we become vigilant about those situations? How do we learn so we do not trust necessarily that the corporation always has our best interest at heart at the workplace? How do we make sure that we're not being exposed to things that could be long-term hazards to our health? And as consumers, what's coming into our homes? And so, one of those famous slogans from one of our presidents in the 1980s was, "Get government off our backs." Well, in a sense, I want government on my back in terms of regulating safety, regulating health, regulating people's consumer products to ensure that people are not exposed to items that are hazardous. And I didn't want to talk too long today because I know there are people here that have lived this, that have may have questions. But before we take questions, I want to ask if anybody here, and Julie, you got the microphone? Yeah. Is anybody who has lived through any of this want to share any of your, don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if anybody wants to share a personal story, I think that would be appropriate to give you that opportunity if anyone would like to do that. And no pressure if it's not comfortable, but if anyone feels the need to share, I wanted to give folks that opportunity. Okay. Good. All right, questions, comment? Yes, ma'am.
Hang on, I'm going to come to you with the
With
mic.
the microphone, so
I
that
see
way everybody
I should have opened that.
can hear the question. Or just
This is how I get my steps.
What years was this factory in operation?
okay. The factory opened here in 1951, and I believe continued to produce asbestos until 1971, so 20 years. It was bought by Owens Corning in 1970, and production shifted to metal sinks, and Larry, you were saying foam insulation was the other thing that was made there. And I've not been able to find an exact year it closed, and the pantograph reports kind of say plants closing around 1981, 82. So we're looking at 20 years of exposure, and something Larry shared earlier too, that terrible ventilation systems. Well, when Owens Corning took over, they improved the ventilation to suck the fibers out and put them out in the neighborhood. So one of the tragedies upstairs is a young man who dies at age 38, living in the vicinity of the plant, who was playing on the playground and is breathing things that come out of the plant here. So it's not just, again, the people that are immediately inside the plant. Jane Menson, this friend of mine, deceased, was a clerical worker. Her first job as a secretary at the plant was working in the office. She was only there a few years and went on to other jobs, but she died of mesothelioma. So it didn't take a lot of exposure to put people in a position of 20, 25 years later coming down with a deadly disease. Good. Thank you. It's a good question. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, over back here. Go ahead. While you're in that neighborhood, why don't you start? And then we'll come up.
The photographs that were on the screen behind you, they're gone, but they look like they were professionally taken. Where are they from? They almost look like they're promoting the workers.
Pantograph, because the museum is the lucky recipient of almost 4 million pantograph negatives. You may recall that every year the Pantograph, what they called a progress edition, and they would, I think it was in the spring, they'd print a special edition of the newspaper. Here's our employers in town. Here's what's going on in agriculture. And they would go around to workplaces and take pictures of people on the job. So most of those, and Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of those came out of the Pantograph negative collection. So yeah, and you speak. Yeah, and we are currently, museums in the process of scanning those negatives. I think we're up to what, 1957, 58, but as soon as they're scanned, they're put on the Illinois Secretary of State Library site so that anybody can access them. And again, there are some pretty incredible photographs there. And then we had Miss.
You spoke about the environmental impact of this, not just on the workers on the floor, but plant workers, the neighborhood, and so on. Another environmental concern was where the material came from and how it got to the plant. Does anyone know, is there anything in the records that tells where they sourced the asbestos and how it was transported?
You mean how the asbestos came?
Literally where it was mined, and then how
in
it was...
South Africa.
Really? Really?
Yeah, so the asbestos, Cape asbestos, and again, there are asbestos mines in North America. It's a commonly found mineral, but the asbestos that was used here came from the company Cape Asbestos in South Africa, put on a ship, brought to somewhere on the East Coast, loaded into boxcar, basically in burlap bags, and then brought to the plant here and unloaded. And the figure we got from one of the women who was kind of a clerical person was 4 tons a day of asbestos coming in. And again, Larry shared unloading those boxcars, right? It just, why don't you hold on, Larry.
I can't, there was a couple, I was in my 20s, and all of a sudden one of our jobs was, there was 3 boxcars that were would have been on the east end of the building. There was tracks that still came in the building because it was a railroad building, and we unloaded it with like a portable elevator that was probably built over here by A.B. Hatchery, and we stacked them probably 20 feet high. Burlap bags probably weighed 80, 90, 100 pounds apiece. So that was one of my last jobs there. But I remember it said product of South Africa right on the bag. Yeah. So, and I don't know what happened to them when they closed the plant, because it wasn't long, and they closed the plant, so they went somewhere, landfill or somewhere. But, yeah. But there was a lot of asbestos there, even when Owens Corning owned it, and that was when Owens Corning had it. So.
Good, thanks, Larry. Jim?
Thank you, Larry.
Behind you, Julie.
Oh, of course.
I was wondering, maybe the attorney who did the lawsuits maybe hired a firm or somebody to do a community health survey. Do we know how many people in Bloomington developed an illness as a result of?
To my knowledge, and Jim, you could answer that if
Sometimes the attorneys, when they're suing the companies, they need some evidence of harm, and so they do epidemiological community surveys.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there weren't any done. And hold on here,
Bring you the
Jim.
mic.
Just to
Wait,
use,
wait. This way we capture it for posterity. There we go. Thank you.
There was no formal study in Bloomington, but another one of the UNARCO plants, or Union Asbestos and Rubber Company plants, was located in Patterson, New Jersey, where they made a number of products similar to what was made in Bloomington. And about the same time, in the late 40s, a little sooner than they moved to Bloomington, but late 40s into the 50s and 60s, And that was extensively studied by a man named Irving Selikoff, who kind of became one of the pioneers in asbestos disease. And, Mike mentioned the asbestos blowing into the community. Well, within medicine, this is called neighborhood disease. And there were quite a few cases of neighborhood disease in Paterson, New Jersey, and there were cases in Bloomington of people who never worked at the plant, never lived with someone who worked at the plant. Those are called household disease, but just lived closely. One of our clients had his picture taken. He was an archer. He had his picture taken in his backyard with his bow and arrow, and in the background of the picture was the sign that was earlier than the one Mike showed. Mike showed UNARCO Industries, Inc. It used to initially say Union Asbestos and Rubber Company. So, and I know the other family that you're talking about. So there were more than one people, more than one victim of this neighborhood disease in Bloomington. Well, one last thing while I got, you talked about studies. They studied the homes of the Paterson, New Jersey workers, and 20 years after no member of that family worked at the plant, there were still high measurable levels of asbestos dust in those homes from going back to the time period when someone in that home did work at the plant and came home with the dust-covered clothes. So the ability of asbestos to remain is hard for us to understand. We kind of think of things like a shot put or a baseball or an ear of corn or something. You can only throw it so far, but an asbestos fiber, it's endless how far it can travel in the air and how long it can stay in the air.
Yeah. So that was a good question, Jim, but I do not know of any like pervasive, comprehensive studies within Bloomington of that. So, good. Other questions, comments, sharing anybody else would like to do? Go ahead, Jim.
A quick follow-up with the attorney. Did anyone win their case in Bloomington? And can you give us numbers on that, or?
Julie's getting a workout here.
Here you go, Jim.
It's a complex
Here you
answer.
go.
It's a complex answer. When we first started, we had a number of challenges, some of which being we were filing our suits too late because families came to me after the knowledge lag was substantial, not inside the corporation, but inside the workforce. So some suits were burdened by time problems. Some suits were burdened by the fact that we just didn't know as much as we later learned about the effects of asbestos on health. But yes, there were a number of suits that were tried to verdict, and verdicts returned in favor of UNARCO plant workers, not against Union Asbestos and Rubber Company, because that company ducked into bankruptcy and escaped ever going to jury trial before we got any case. UNARCO was about the first major company to file bankruptcy as a result of its asbestos problems. Then Johns Manville, one of the even larger than UNARCO, was maybe the second, so they had very few actual jury trials against them. We tried cases against other companies that had different roles in the operation of the plant. And many of the cases that did result in a verdict for the plaintiff were appealed, and some of those appeals influenced how much was recovered and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, and Illinois at one point changed the law because there was statute of limitations almost. How long can you file a case? And Illinois changed the law to expand, particularly for asbestos, how long you could file cases. Well, actually, when we were starting this exhibit 10 years ago, the Panagraph was full of articles about McLean County judicial hellhole, because people were winning asbestos cases in this county, and the Tort Lawyers Association or the Tort business association, I shouldn't say the tort lawyers, business associations and groups were criticizing McLean County because people were winning settlements here, even more heavily criticizing Madison County, Illinois, which Granite City, that area where you got a lot of heavy industry, there were multiple cases around multiple exposures to different things, and the industry was just up in arms that somehow people were shopping a good location to file a case, and that McLean County people were getting too big of settlements. And one of the things that in the article I wrote that struck me is a woman who was representing this corporate interest wrote an article about a paragraph guest editorial about how big these settlements were in McLean County and how terrible that was for industry. At no point in her commentary did she even offer a shred of sympathy to the victims. You know, this is just a terrible burden on corporations. And I think the other thing too to think about is we as citizens are still paying for it. Normal public library this summer is under asbestos remediation. Almost every school in McLean County has had an asbestos remediation. I think Susan did some good research on that, and we came up with a total of, $3 million in asbestos remediation cost for local school districts and local government. So that's, UNARCO didn't pay that, Johns Manville didn't pay that. We, the taxpayer, are paying for that remediation. So in other words, there's still a social cost that's still with us today. And one of the things as you go through upstairs as a laborer, we do asbestos remediation, and you'll see kind of the 3 stages that a person goes through in terms of like booths that they move through, containment areas, to make sure they're not carrying anything home with them when they're done doing the remediation project. So again, that's not an inexpensive process to air seal an area and remove something, make sure it goes to a designated landfill or site where it can be buried, and even the hazardous waste suits that people wear become a hazard and have to be buried also. So again, it's a social cost besides the victim cost. It's a cost that all of us are bearing still today. Any other questions, comments? Well, I hope folks take the time.
I have a question for Susan, because I know some of you have seen upstairs, some of you haven't yet, but how do you take a story like this and translate it into an exhibit? I love putting Susan on the spot, but I'd just love to hear a little bit from your perspective.
And stand up, Susan, stand up.
I guess I'm a juggler, and it's kind of a circus, because you have all this data, and in this case, not a lot of objects, but some really amazing images, and I'm juggling, how am I going to fit this in? How am I going to organize this? What do we have to include? What do we need to not include? And it's just a challenge that I really enjoy, but this one was particularly challenging because there were no artifacts. So.
Yeah, and just Susan and I went through, I think I was looking the other day, 20 scripts from our first draft, and continually, here's new information, how do we prioritize, because you don't want to overload people with information, but at the same time you want to get the key points there, you want to be visual, and so we're back and forth constantly writing and rewriting, trying to hone the story down. And you got, go ahead, hold on, Julie. Go ahead.
21, because you don't have the last version.
Okay. But in other words, it's having worked on these before, we probably start with twice as much material as we need, but then how do we bring that down to, a manageable story? And as you tour the exhibits and tour downstairs, the permanent exhibits, that's all Susan's genius and Susan's art and work that's in those. Jeff?
Yeah, Mike, thank you. I just had a question about how are we to think about, as you being the co-curator for this and also a labor leader, what is a really good takeaway for us as the public to tackle something like this?
Okay, that's a very good question. I was with some folks who went through ISU together, and they reminded that we all wore buttons in the 1970s that said "question authority." And I think that's something we constantly have to do, is ask questions and ask questions again and again, because, oh, this is safe. Oh, this is going to be a wonderful consumer product. Oh, this is, we're watching over you in the workplace. And don't presume the goodwill of the person whose motive is profit. Hopefully they have a conscience, hopefully they have morality, and hopefully they are watching out for your interest, or hopefully, even from a mercenary point of view, they're afraid enough of lawsuits that they're going to be careful about what they do. But again, ask questions. And don't be afraid, and that's as I think Jeff's alluding to, and Jeff's a former UAW member out at Mitsubishi. You got to stand up, and one of the wonderful benefits of having a union is you're not standing up as an individual. You have an organization you can go through. So if a question arises about safety, about exposure, you're not the person that stands up and say, hey boss, is this safe for me? Oh, it's wonderful, but there's the door, you're fired. You've got a structure then to come in and say, the organization can come in and say, we've got our own health and safety people in the union. We want to come in and inspect. We want to come in and verify that the ventilation is right. That the ergonomics are right, that people are not being put in situations that can cause not just immediate harm, but long-term harm. It's one thing when you work on a construction site and you're seeing stuff, you're like, okay, I'm not going to do this today because I don't want to put my life at risk to do this. Also very incredibly important to think about, and you as an auto worker, Jeff, or Diane working at Eureka, if I'm pushing that air drill on the same motion, how many 100 times a day, what does that do to my tendons and my muscles and my arms without having proper equipment to be able to do that right? So I'm not destroying my physical health in the process. And same way with occupational exposures, with anything you're asked to put on a wall or to put on a floor. If there's dust, it's a hazard. I think, again, one of the films I like to go back and look at, in 1935, the U.S. Department of Labor produced a film on the dangers of silica, concrete dust. It was not until the Obama administration that OSHA promulgated a rule on concrete dust. And so now if you're out cutting concrete, you see folks with that concrete saw on the highway, it now has to have an attachment to put water on it to settle the dust. How many times have construction workers been out cutting concrete and just breathing in silica? 1935, the U.S. Department of Labor was warning about it. It takes, until the 2000s to be able to get a rule on silica. So again, constant vigilance on safety is something that I think no matter where you work, and you say, oh, I work in an office. I know a good friend who worked at ISU and worked in one of the newer buildings, and she developed respiratory diseases because there was not a good air circulation system in the building. Or for artists, if you're working in what the ISU basement of the art area, people are soldering and doing all kinds of art in a building built in the 1970s that doesn't have ventilation for doing that kind of work. That's not necessarily a factory job, but those are hazardous situations which people need to be careful and be alert to. Good. Any other questions, comments? Take your time, go upstairs.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, appreciate it. Oh, did you have? Yeah, okay.